I am Caroline Muturi from IBON Africa, and I will be hosting this podcast. So we hope to unpack one, critical minerals extraction in Africa, and also examine the key free trade agreements and, of course, strategic partnerships, mostly between the northern and southern countries that enable this large-scale extraction and resource plunder, especially in the global south. So I'm delighted today to have along with me seasoned activists from Africa. We have Mela Chiponda from SHINE Collab and also Jane Nalunga from SEATINI. And I request you ladies to kindly introduce yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. My name is Mela Chiponda, and please call me Mela. And I'm based in Harare, Zimbabwe. I work for the SHINE Collab, but I'm an activist, an anti-extractivist activist, extractivism activist, and an energy and climate activist as well. I identify as an African ecofeminist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mela. Ms. Jane, kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Carolina, and thanks, Mela. Great to be with you on this podcast. I'm Jane Nalunga. I work for SEATINI. SEATINI is Southern and Eastern African Trade, Information and Negotiations Institute. We are based in Uganda and work on economic policy issues, that's trade, investment, fiscal policies, to make sure that those policies work for the people and they work for the planet.
Thank you so much, Jenny. From this point, I would like us to dive into our conversation today, basically on the critical minerals industry and the Southern voices and how we can promote people-centered approaches. And in line with the so-called the Northern-led transition and how free trade agreements and deals are and currently being used and weaponized to streamline the extraction and exploitation of southern minerals. My question is, how do the current trade system reproduce colonial patterns of extraction? And could you kindly share how extractivist free trade agreements, especially in Africa with the US or the European Union, have reshaped territorial, ecological, or reproductive autonomy in Africa? So may I have Jane first and then Mel?
Okay, thank you so much, Carolina, for that question. In fact, for us to understand the current debate and contestation around energy transition, around the way the EU, the global south, global north, is extracting and imposing energy transition measures on the global south, we need to go back and understand the relationship between the global south and the global north. And I will give examples about Africa when it comes to the relationship between Africa and the European Union and also Africa and the US. When you look at that relationship since pre-colonial times, then we look at the colonial times, then we look at after independence and even now, the relationship has been extractivist. The global north extracting resources from the global south. And we can start right from the slaves, the pre-colonial extracting people. Then we look at the colonial times, extraction of agriculture and mineral resources. In my country, for example, in my country, it was growing cotton, growing coffee, then also the minerals. So that relationship has been extracting. And the relationship has been such that the Global South looks at and addresses the challenges in the Global North. So the resources from the Global South were for the industries in the Global North. And in return, they could give us value-added products, clothes. We send cotton, they bring textiles. So that unequal exchange has been in place even until now. And when we will look at later the agreements, the treaties we are signing, they are to continue that kind of relationship. But I could also give examples of how the Global North, especially EU, has tried to entrench that relationship. For example, they put in place sometime way back the STABEX, as stabilization of exports. And they were stabilizing the price of raw commodities so that we can be able to continue exporting the raw commodities. Again, it was stabilizing the cost of minerals. But on the other hand, they put in place tariff escalation measures that if you add value to your produce, for example, if you are exporting coffee beans, it's okay. But you make coffee powder, there are high tariffs. So that's how the relationship between Europe and Africa, that's how it has been. Very asymmetrical, very extractivist. And it has had challenges on the women because our economy is based on agriculture, small-scale agriculture. And it's the women who are the producers of all these raw products which go to Europe. Yet the policies in our countries, they don't recognize they don't recognize what women put in to produce those products. So when you look at our economy, we are under the value chains. We are as Africans at the bottom of the value chains, and at the very bottom of that value chain are the women. So these are the issues I think which we need to look at, and it's important we also look at the current agreements and policies depending on where we are coming from, our history. I will give you an example. We are negotiating a free trade agreement, the economic partnership agreement with the EU, with the European Union. When you look at that agreement, we are liberalizing more, opening up our economy for their products to come in. But there are also clauses, for example, regarding export taxes. Export taxes are important for us to industrialize, but the European Union is saying no export taxes because they want our raw materials to go to Europe. They want our minerals as raw without any value addition to go to Europe. But we also need to look at the issues, the policies they are putting in place in Europe. For example, they have the Critical Minerals Act, and that act is about sourcing, putting in place strategies of how to source raw materials from the Global South. So when we look at the current system, where we are coming from, where we are, the whole issue about energy transition, we are looking at deepening that extractivist relationship, which is negatively impacting on our people, on our women, especially the rural women, where these resources are extracted.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jenny. And I have a comment on that, but before, I would like to request Ms. Mela to add on what you've just shared.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you very much, Jane. And I want to start from where Jane has left the discussion, but just taking us back to when Jane was introducing herself to say they are working on making or on ensuring that the earth can sustain both human life and as well the environment. And that on its own speaks to how, as people from the global south, as people in Africa, our lives are so tied to the land. Our lives are tied to the environment and to our ecosystems. And therefore, that is the starting point for this whole discussion about extractivism. And looking at the colonial agenda, the colonial agenda was an agenda that was hinged on capitalism. It was hinged on patriarchal systems. It was hinged on structural violence against the people of the global south, but as well the working class in the global north, because we see how this violence that was perpetuated in Africa did not necessarily start from Africa itself, but it starts from the time of the Industrial Revolution, where people, for example, in Britain, were dispossessed of their lands and of their territories during the Great Enclosure System. And now we see how the growth of capital led to wanting more raw materials, wanting to create markets, consumers for their products. But that could not sustain itself without an ideology that makes development attractive. I'll give the example of the Truman Doctrine and the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, which I believe are all colonial machinations. When we read the Truman's doctrine about the issue of modernization and how he says every country is supposed to emulate the US, is supposed to Europeanize or to Americanize. And therefore, what does it mean for every country in the whole world to aspire to be Western and to aspire to be from the global north? It means that a lot of things have to come into play. The issue of the ideological apparatus, but as well the repression itself. And we see how extractivism and the current extraction of green minerals or the critical minerals that are needed for the renewable energy sector did not start now, because we started with the extraction of fossil fuels, the extraction of coal, the extraction how the coal in Zimbabwe was shipped to Katanga, for example, to fund the Second World War. We have seen the conflicts that have happened in the Niger Delta, where there was oil extraction. And we continue to see that now, even, talking about the fossil fuels in Uganda, where Jane is from, we see how the extraction, the exploration, the extraction of oil is justified somehow because the country needs to develop. And therefore, the extraction and the violence associated with critical minerals, it's not surprising. Why it's not surprising? Because it is taking place within a development model that has failed the people of Africa and the people of the global south. And I want to end by for now by saying this, right? When we look at the impoverishment of the Black African people and the Black African women, we see how the colonial agenda deliberately pushed African women to the periphery of peripheries through extracting the labor of their male counterparts to go and work in what we are now calling cities for wage labor, depriving the women of the value of the labor of their spouses within the household economy, meaning that the work that was done by African women during the colonial administration, it was much more, and as well, it was undervalued because the women were not getting wages out of what indeed is something that is supposed to be paid for. And we see how even within the current development model, as African women, we all aspire to be able to leave the village, and go to the city and be able to earn money. Why? Because the work that we do as food producers, the work that we do as stewards of our ecosystems, it is undervalued, it is invisibilized, and it is work that is so critical to sustain life on earth, but that work is bastardized. Why? Because it is not serving capital. It is work that is serving the people. It is work that is serving our environment, our ecosystems, and therefore it is work that is considered to be not work in quotes. And with this green this decarbonization extractivism that is ongoing right now, it is justified again by text to say the whole world needs to transition. But let me just say, African people have been transitioning since time immemorial. People had been transitioning from one development model to the other. They had been doing this on their own. And even our energy systems, they have transitioned from one form to the other. But what we are concerned about as African people, as people from the global south, is that this is coming with so much violence. This is coming with the colonization again of our territories by large corporations, multinationals who are doing that through support from their governments. And this is also disempowering to the African governments and their peoples because of the debt that has been accrued over the years, and some of it, the colonial debt that comes way back before we were even independent in Africa. And therefore, we are kind of trapped in this colonial perfected role of being the producers of raw materials for the global market, in quotes. But this is not a global market. This is the production of countries in the global north. Thank you. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Mela. That was so powerful. And I'm glad to hear especially about the great introduction of the whole context from pre-colonial, colonial, and even post-colonial, the kind of exploitation that Africa continues to face and the global south. And adding on to that, we have the Africa still opening its markets to the global north. This year, 2025, marks 5 years after the AfCFTA was launched. And speaking on that, I think there's a thick line between like in regards to the AfCFTA and how, of course, it's supposed to increase the intra-African trade within African countries, and also how the initiative is also being used by the multinational corporations and the global north to open the region for its markets and, of course, for more extractivism. And I think we need to have more of these conversations to really understand the context and see how we can come in as civil society actors. And Mela, do you have maybe a point to add on that?
Just very little to I just to us to provoke ourselves that what we calling free trade agreements, are they free? And then the whole continent has been reduced to a supermarket where goods just come in and we are supposed to buy and consume, and they come in and consume. And so I just want to maybe build on to what Jane said about the Africa Mining Vision, that maybe what is needed right now is our vision for a just transition. I don't want to call it just energy transition only, because a lot of things have to transition. There's so much that needs to change, that needs to transform. And therefore, for me, the issue is not just about energy. The issue is about a system that perpetuates energy injustice. Because for me, right now, the narrative that is coming from the global North is just, oh, change the technologies, and then wow, there is a just transition because now we are using renewable energy instead of a fossil fuels driven energy system. But hey, what about the historical injustice of those that have been severely impacted by the fossil fuels industry? What is going to be done to the communities who are hosting the critical minerals? Are we going to be extracting lithium in Zimbabwe so that we do justice to people in the global north, or so that the lithium can be used to make solar batteries for the solar vehicles in Europe? I don't think that the communities in Zimbabwe or in the DR Congo or in Zambia, where there's extraction of copper, would give up their minerals for some elites to drive electric vehicles in the global north. And for me, the transition should ensure that those who don't have access to energy right now can have access to energy as a right, and energy not as a commodity, but as a commons. So that is just something I feel I could add. Thank you.
Carolina, can I come in on the issue that has raised? A very, very critical issue, the issue of having our own narrative. When you look at our history, we swallow narratives. All the narratives are pushed on us. That structured adjustment programs, when you liberalize, when you do this, when you do that, you are going to develop. Now they are telling us critical minerals and energy transition. And the question Mela is asking very critically, transitioning from what? Where are we going? You know, and also the whole issue of critical minerals, critical for who? You know, because when we talk about critical minerals, really, lithium, why should I care about lithium when, or even an electric vehicle, when we are still using a hand hoe to grow what we are eating, to grow what we are exporting, you know? So for me, what I see is that we need to develop our own narrative rooted in our realities. And that's when we can be able to say, this is a critical mineral or it's not a critical mineral. There are other critical minerals like clay to make plates, to do what, you know, clay, soil, salt. So when we talk about critical minerals, they have to be critical for our well-being. They have to be critical for our livelihoods, not critical for somebody to buy electric vehicles, to do very high technology, robotics and AI. So we need to link transition to our reality, to our experience, but also to our aspiration, where we are and where we want to be.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mela and Jenny. And yes, Africa holds 30% of world's critical minerals. And the question of critical to whom is critical because for sure, if these minerals are not serving our needs as a region, then they're not critical to us. And this is a conversation that we really need to have. We need to shape our own narratives as a region. And we need to continuously promote people-centered approaches towards system change, because the whole system needs an overhaul, from the capitalistic system to a people-centered system that is working for everyone, not for the few elite. So to that note, I would like us to go to the second question. So my question is, what role have do feminist or people's organizations or people's alliances played in resisting extractivism in Africa? And what would a feminist or a people-led approach to resource sovereignty look like in your own community?
Indeed, women have been putting their lives on the front line. And why? Because, as I mentioned previously, that women's lives are African women's lives are so tied to the land, because women do the most critical work, that is life giving. Women work through the whole food value chain when we look at our local economies. And women are already organized. I've always said this, that women in Africa, they are already organized.
Hello?
Because we see women being organized around their livelihoods. Women are organized around their spiritual practices, around their traditional practices. They are so organized that this is why we see the struggles in Africa, the struggles for injustice, the struggles for land, women on the forefront. Women are on the forefront. Though, of course, mostly nobody sings songs about the critical role that women play in the resistance, but we have it. We have seen how, even when we look at the very old resistance that was done, whether we want to talk about Queen Jinga of Angola, or we want to talk about the Aba Rebellion in West Africa, where women organized against colonial taxation, against tax injustice. And we are still organizing as women, where market women in West Africa came together to resist and to refuse to pay unjust taxes. And we have seen how in Zimbabwe, the liberation movement was started by a woman, Nyanda, and this continues. And we are seeing how women are organizing against extraction of their resources. They are organizing against dispossession of their rivers, of their lands. And let me just say that our lands and our territories do not mean anything to someone who is coming from Europe, or who is coming from the global north, or someone who has internalized the capitalist, neoliberal capitalist models of development. Those rivers don't make sense. They will say, we went to Africa, we went to Zimbabwe, we went to Uganda, and we went to Kenya, and it was so underdeveloped, because they are seeing the river flowing freely in its natural state, and there is no dam, and there is no cement or nothing was put in that river. They would consider that as underdevelopment. And we have seen how, when they look at the rich forests, the rich indigenous forests, they would look and say, oh, there's infrastructure, because what we saw, there were the round huts, and that place is underdeveloped. But for us, that is the development model that we are organizing for, because we know that when something happens on the rivers, when there's pollution of our rivers, we are going to be impacted. The bodies of women are going to be severely impacted by pollution of our water bodies, because we handle water every day. Water is sacred to us. Water is very critical to us, and therefore we would rather let the rivers flow. And the same with our forests, the same with our mountains. They have spiritual value. That's where we get our healing. That is where we get our herbs. And therefore, we will resist through organizing against any encroachment into our territories. We have seen the Chipko movement, how the women in India were hugging trees because these trees were more important to them than the rubber industry. We are not saying that let us not develop, but we are saying who defines what development is and development for who? Like what Carolina asked about critical minerals, critical for who? And whose critical minerals are we talking about? And therefore, women are creating spaces for learning. We are seeing women creating spaces for safety, for their collective care. And those spaces are very critical within the movement, within the feminist movement, because that is where we have the places to develop the alternative, or let me just say our own eco-feminist African local economies, because we cannot say, for example, if we look at countries like Malawi, where 80% of the people are living in rural areas, and in Zimbabwe, where 66% of the people are living in rural areas, we cannot destroy their ecosystems so so that they fail to produce food, because that is what matters to the majority of the people in that country. And in this case, the majority of the women in Africa, they rely on healthy ecosystems for survival. Women in Senegal, for example, they rely on the health of their sea, of their water bodies, which we have seen how there is coastal erosion, there is rising sea levels because of the climate crisis. In the climate crisis, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, mentioning that this climate crisis has its origin and roots during the time of the Industrial Revolution, which is also the time of the colonization project, and therefore all the need to decolonize, all the need to start questioning a capitalist-driven development model and start rethinking what we are considering development at the moment and organizing for our alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mela. That was really powerful. And I will just add on to what you have said about women, feminist groups, and people's groups and movements. What the role they have played in restructuring the extractivist mode of development. I have seen people and I have seen feminist groups really pushing against this model, amplifying women's voices, and also sharing experiences. I have seen documentaries, about areas where extractivist activities are going on and their impact on the women, their impact on food production, and their impact on water. I have seen documentaries where water has been poisoned because of the chemicals they use to extract the minerals. So women groups, people's groups have been able to amplify voices, to be able to bring out these issues to the fore. And I have seen women groups also engaging in agreements, in policy advocacy. In my region, in the East African region, we as people's organizations, women groups, we have fought against the economic partnership agreements with the EU for the last 23 years. And it's just recent that they forced Kenya to sign, but the entire East African region refused to sign it. So these are some of the efforts really which need to be documented. Again, in the East African region, I have seen people's groups and women groups fighting for the review of the investment legal frameworks to be able to mainstream issues, for example, human rights impact assessments, which are not there. So the women are doing a lot of work, pushing against the commodification of social services in budgets, in tax policies. So there's a lot of work being done. But what we have to remember is that there are new challenges coming on board. For example, like now what we are talking about, the challenges of energy transition, which has brought new challenges, new issues on board. And we are seeing the scramble for our resources by the global north, by China, the US, Australia, the EU. This scramble is also bringing new challenges. We are looking at the false solution to the climate issue. Issues are around carbon credits, carbon markets, which are going to displace so many of our people. So I think I want to go back to the issue Mela has raised, the issue of rethinking, the issue of putting bold alternatives on the table, because we have to agree as people's movements, as feminist movements. Do you want to tinker around the edges? Like now, if they tell us energy transition, critical minerals, and we say, okay, we will do it, but why don't you center the women? Do we need to tick around that? Or do we take a bold stand and put bold alternatives on the table? For example, the Latin Americans have a movement now saying, let us leave these minerals in the ground because they are not critical to us. They are doing more harm than good. Can we be able to do that? We need to rethink the entire issue around development, around structural transformation, around what we grow and what we eat, around centering the needs of the global north against the needs, our own needs. So for me, in conclusion, I think it's very, very important to be able to put on table alternatives that are rooted in our challenges, that are rooted in our aspirations, that are rooted in justice, that are rooted in equity, that are rooted in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the parting shot and for your great presentations. And if you have one parting shot, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carolina. My hope is that we continue dreaming, we continue to think through how, as Africa, we can have and build, and have regenerative, climate just local economies that are driven by decentralized renewable energy systems that are controlled by the women and other indigenous groups who are users of the same energy systems. Thank you so much.
I would also like to say, in conclusion, that I pray that feminist movements, people's movements, are bold enough to be able to question the unquestionable.